The Zoom has begun. All right, so this is really exciting. I am so excited that we have Richard McCann reading for us tonight. Anyone who knows Richard knows that he is stunningly generous and kind. And when I was a fresh-faced poet just out of graduate school with a first book under my belt 12 years ago, Richard was incredibly supportive, and I knew that I always had a champion in him. He has been a stunningly significant writer, teacher, and administrator, taking active roles in the Fine Arts Work Center, editing a groundbreaking anthology of writing from the first wave of the AIDS crisis, and shaping the MFA program at American University. And if you want to know just how important Richard's contributions have been, there's an opening for you, because the University of Delaware has his papers, and there are 13.2 linear feet of material organized in 7 sections, just waiting for you to mine. However, biographers are being beaten to the punch, since tonight we're going to be hearing from Richard's memoir in progress, which is as eagerly anticipated as his collection of linked stories, Mother of Sorrows, which was a huge celebrated work in the 2000s. I know Richard's work best from his 1994 award-winning collection of poems, Ghost Letters, which is a vibrant and forthright celebration of the erotic community formed by gay men, as well as an examination of loss, of grief, and of having grown up in the kind of America that was supposed to look like a Norman Rockwell painting, but didn't. It used to be a commonplace that queer time was out of order, that because of AIDS and because we don't have children, our life cycles were out of step with the generational procession that had ordered the world prior to us. In returning to Richard's work, I'm finding that to be true, that without failing to see how much work Richard McCann did to build and nurture the spaces that I inhabit as a gay writer, his work is stunningly present, not just of a time past, but of a time that's here and of a time that's still to come. Please welcome Richard McCann.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great line about queer time being out of time or out of step. That's a great line. Jason, thank you very much for inviting me to this series. It's great to see you. And I'm still your ardent fan, ardently so. And Jodi, thank you for inviting me to read with you tonight. I'm really looking forward to it, to hearing you. And I want to say thank you to various friends who are here as well. Oh, including my friend Cord from Germany. I'm going to read everything I work on. It takes a really long time. Like, I'm the slowest writer in America and the underworld, you know. But what I'm working on now is a book I started 20 years ago with one essay, and it's slowly growing now almost to be the size of a book. So I'm really glad to say that. The title of this book is The Resurrectionist, which most people think it means like, yay, resurrection. But resurrectionist is a 19th century British slang term for a grave robber. Okay? And what this book covers is my experience as a liver transplant recipient, hence grave robber. This is like brand new, like just printed it out this morning. And it's called What I Lived For. And it might be the last essay in this collection. I'm not sure. That's not time for that yet. But What I Lived For is what it is. I often sat beside Dennis at the local AA clubhouse, soiled carpet, flimsy metal folding chairs, where we were both regulars, attending the same weekly meeting that began each Sunday at 6:00 p.m. I was nervous when I took a seat beside him, given his penchant for sudden, unpredictable outbursts that often started with a kind of frenzied hectoring, like an evangelical preacher, and ended with exhaustion and something like tears. One night, anxiously waving his arms about, Dennis cried, "It doesn't matter if you all hate me, because I have to love you to stay sober." Another night, he stood straight away from his seat to declaim, "You've got to learn to love your life, no matter how much you hate it." Everyone there was at least half scared of him, even the junkies and the crackheads who sometimes joined us in that small bare room, one flight up from the noisy street. People were scared of his sudden explosions of anger, and even by his erratic but passionate avidity. People were also scared, I suspect, because he was so visibly dying. depletion of muscle, gaunt and hollowed face. At least that fear was true of me. When he sat beside me, I could feel the imminence of his death was bringing my own death closer. This was the same year I was diagnosed with end-stage liver disease. The same year, the same year I started waiting, hope against hope, for a liver transplant that might save my life, even if just for a year or two. I seldom saw Dennis outside that AA meeting room. Once at the Washington National Cathedral, I'd seen him at an AIDS healing service, wearing a blue blazer, pink shirt, a pair of khakis, and tassel loafers. So he looked like something he once had been, an undergraduate at Georgetown University. But his face looked old and blistered, possibly due to his strict regime of visiting day spas for extractions and needlings and oxygen masks formulated from retin A and aloe vera grown in the Sonoran Desert. That day I saw him at the cathedral, his face was frightening, raw and inflamed, as if it had been skinned from the bone and then quickly slathered with something that glistened, like petroleum jelly. He was hastening down the south aisle toward a radiating chapel where the diocesan bishop was about to offer his blessing. I would have called out to him if we hadn't been in a Gothic cathedral. Space. Did I love my life even if I hated it? No, not really. Not then. Of course, there was a transplant of which I was terrified. For a while, I felt the whole thing had been a grievous error, no matter how bad the news and the biopsies had to say. I couldn't believe I needed a transplant. That's not me, I thought. I decided to consult with a renowned South African hepatologist, of whom it was said that he was impossible to see. He was that famous. But I persisted. He was practicing then at the VA hospital in Washington, D.C. I went to ask him if there were alternatives to transplantation. I had no idea what I meant by that. You're very sick, he told me, reviewing my labs. If you aren't lucky enough to get a transplant, you will die. In case I thought it would be easier to die than to undergo transplantation, he added, my dying of liver failure would be painful and merciless and brutal. It wasn't like drifting to sleep, after all. When I exited the hospital, I saw a small band of veterans loitering near the entrance, drinking from cans of Colt 45. Faggot, a couple of them muttered as I passed through on my way back to the parking lot. But it wasn't just the transplant that beset me. It was AIDS, too. In the 10 years preceding the transplant, I'd lost so many friends and loved ones, I couldn't even start to conceive of an illness narrative in which anyone ever got better, including my best friend Stanley, who'd been diagnosed with metastatic melanoma, or my then partner, Jaime, who was among the first in DC to be diagnosed with what was then called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency. At night, I often sat beside Jaime on the living room sofa as he fingered his swollen lymph glands in his neck. Don't do that, I told him. Everything was AIDS. At the time of Jaime's diagnosis, there had been 7,699 AIDS cases in the US. By the year of my liver transplant 10 years later, the number had grown to 23 million worldwide. Dinner party chatter, circa AIDS time. Did you hear about Dwayne? What about Charlie? Did you hear about the hemophiliac from Indiana who was only 10 years old when he got the news? Someone had seen Arcadio at the dry cleaners with a Kaposi sarcoma lesion on his cheek. Did anyone hear about Darnell? He was stopped in a crosswalk, so confused as to be frozen in the middle of the road. Who here has tried AL-721? It's an egg lipid from Israel that tastes so shitty you have to smear it on toast. What about DDI, compound Q or dextrin sulfate? And what about Larry, who was diagnosed with pneumocystis and died within a week? Then came AZT, the first antiviral approved by the FDA for the treatment of AIDS, even though it killed you while keeping you alive. Jaime didn't live long enough to try protease inhibitors, the next and more successful generation of AIDS drugs. By the time he was admitted to the hospital for the last time, he was gaunt and skeletal, weighing less than 85 pounds. He often shat himself. Thrush fell continually from his mouth and throat, as if it were moist white lumps of cottage cheese. By then he was enraged by almost everyone, including me, his doctors, nurses, nursing assistants, orderlies, home health aides, and the man who brought him his food on a tray. He was vexed by his English spaniel, whom he kept in a cage. A couple of years before, we had broken up. He'd said he couldn't trust me, although at his request, I still held his healthcare proxy and DNR orders. Daytimes, if he was not in hospital, I'd visit him at his cluttered townhouse, where he sat up in his king-size sleigh bed, paging through the Washington Post, looking at full-page ads of things he felt he needed to own, like designer sheet sets and plush towels and Brooks Brothers neckties. He'd then phone the stores to place his order, paying with his Amex Gold card. In the last 2 months before his death, he ordered 2 new down duvets, 2 ruffled bed skirts, 12 sterling silver place settings, a set of Hartman luggage, a dozen Lacoste polo shirts in all colors, an electric hibachi, a Trinity ring in 3 types of gold, and a Cartier Santos watch, all of it still unopened in original packaging. I know this because after Jaime died, it fell to me to return as much of the merchandise as possible. Were these the things he had lived for? In the month before his death, the only thing he praised excitably was the afternoon his AIDS buddy took him to Popeyes for spicy fried chicken. Space. Maybe like 8 weeks before I received the call from the transplant coordinator summoning me for my transplant, I was admitted through the ER to the hospital due to life-threatening esophageal varices. I'd been standing in my kitchen when I suddenly started to hemorrhage from my mouth. The blood as thick and dark as coffee grounds. My friend Sue drove me quickly to the hospital. The only thing I remember from the next 5 days was when a doctor implanted a stent in my portal vein to better my odds of not bleeding to death. That and a brightly colored mylar balloon that was tied to the bottom of my hospital bed, waving and bobbing whenever anyone came near. After I was discharged, I learned that Dennis had entered a hospital too, in his case for biopsies of his underarms and AIDS-related lymphoma. When I went to visit, I found him sitting up in bed, wearing his silk dressing gown and fielding quick phone calls on his cell phone. Jesus, he said after he hung up. He gave a look of mock exasperation. Then he laughed. Well, he said, I guess you know now what I do for a living. I told him I didn't get it. That's when he motioned for me to come closer. He worked out of his studio apartment, he told me, providing what he called men's services. He said that the kind of massage he performed wasn't the certified kind, but rather the kind with a happy ending. In retrospect, I wonder if he might have seen the slightest tinge of horror across my face. I had right then been imagining what his clients must have thought when he opened his apartment door to greet them. He looked awful. His hospital pallor and his cadaverous body and face with patches of acne running across his hairline. Without my having to ask, he said, most of the men are older and married. He said that by the time they'd screwed up enough courage to tap on his door, they weren't going anywhere else. They were in all the way. Not one of them, he said, had ever hesitated or backed away. The next time I saw Dennis, he wanted to drive us around the neighborhood in his hunter green Mustang convertible with the top down. It was a beautiful spring day, he said. Let's drive around the neighborhood and see who's dying. The streets were crowded. Dennis drove slowly down 17th Street, as if in a private parade, honking his car horn whenever he spotted someone on the sidewalk whom he knew. At one point, he stopped in front of a busy outdoor cafe, where he kept calling to the men seated there, "Hey, girl! Yes, girl, I mean you." A half dozen of the men, some shirtless, came over to greet him. Had I squinted hard enough, I might have seen an older, casual gentleman presenting his business cards to the younger men around him. I adore my Mustang, Dennis said, caressing the steering wheel as we drove back to his place. I'm living for you, baby, he told the car. What do any of us live for? From having memorized it while preparing for my holy confirmation, I know what the Baltimore Catechism has to say. Question: who made you? Answer: God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world, and to be happy with him in heaven forever. When people asked me what I was living for, as they sometimes did back when I was still waiting for a donor organ, I told them I was living for work and love. I wanted more of each, I said. I should have realized even then that these words were too earnest and too solemn to be true. What did my mother live for? She was 84 at the time of her death. By then, she no longer recognized me or my brother herself. Perhaps because she'd always been what people used to call a big reader, she continued her daily practice, sitting in her recliner with a paperback in her hands, though she was often holding the paperback upside down. And Dennis? He died while I was in the hospital having my transplant. When I later asked his AA sponsor about the disposition of Dennis's Mustang, he told me that Dennis had had to sell the car a couple of months before to keep paying for his medications. And about my best friend, Stanley, who died of metastatic melanoma. At the start of his illness, he'd pulled me aside one afternoon to make me swear I would help him to die if the melanoma proved too unspeakable to bear. The cancer first took hold in the mucosal tissue of his soft palate. Then it metastasized to his lymph nodes, which had to be excised from both sides of his neck. Then it traveled to his left lung. He underwent a pneumonectomy in which his whole left lung was removed. Then to the brain, causing him to suffer over and over from seizures. The last time I saw him was at Sloan Kettering, where he'd gone for treatment, and I was wheeling him in a chair to the radiation suite, where we'd both been instructed to part from each other the minute before the tech stepped in to blast him with radiation. Stanley was miserable, slumped in his wheelchair. I took this moment to whisper to him, Stan, is this the time you spoke of? If you want my help. Suddenly he was furious. What do you think, he demanded. Don't you think I want to continue living? How do you think I don't want to keep living all the way to the end? What did my brother live for in his last year before his overdose from heroin, cocaine, and speed? Could one say, toward the end, he was living for heroin, cocaine, and speed? Look at me, Dennis demanded one night at our weekly Sunday meeting. He was pointing an index finger indignantly toward his own wasted body. Look at me, he repeated. I was supposed to be a flight attendant. In her last years, my mother perfected her survival skills by sitting in her wheelchair, glowering at anybody who dared to come near. When I was young, I lived for what I thought of as lyrical moments, when the things of life suddenly heightened and approached the transcendent. The May afternoons I spent lying in the sun beside the Alhambra. The warm nights my friends and I'd gather in the cramped cafe bar Lolita in a whitewashed gypsy cave in Sacramonte, where the locals drank from liter Coke bottles that were now filled with vino tinto. The nights I lay with Manuel Mendoza Hernandez del Gato, mi hermoso, one name for each day I loved him. Of course, if you live long enough, you start thinking more and more, not about the lyrical, but rather about plot and narrative time. My friend Stanley died 30 years ago, but I still call him my best friend. How could it be that I've now had my transplant for 24 years? Time is hard to grasp, said St. Augustine of Hippo. I think sometimes I am living for the breeze, moving through the elm tree in my third floor window. I don't know what I was born for, if anything. Sometimes I'm living for the afternoon light at Herring Cove. I dream that I am living for the moon to set and the sun to rise. I am living to stay alive. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, I can't unmute, I can mute everyone at once, but I can't unmute everyone at once. So I hope you saw all of that applause, that there was like a huge amount of it. Usually we try to, if it's a smaller group, then we can unmute everyone, but with this, I'll just be pressing over and over. So thank you so much. That was really wonderful.
It's my pleasure. Pleasure
That's
also to
really such a joy.
This summer.
So I'm going to hand it over. John.
Yes.
Should we take like a little break, or should we?
Yeah, why don't we just give like 3 minutes? Everybody can maybe, if they want to refresh their beverage or whatever,
Okay.
and then we'll start up the second half.
I'm going to put up the Venmo code. So if you want to contribute to KGB, because as you know, it's a bar, so no one can be here for the duration of the COVID. So if you want to kind of make sure that the space is still here, and if you want to take care of Seiji, our beloved bartender who we don't get to see while we're away, this is the Venmo code if you want to make a contribution. And I put the link to order Richard's book in the chat, and we'll put another link in for Jodi when we get to that. All right, so everyone just take like a couple minutes and refresh your drinks. You can't see, the green screen takes away my drink. You can't see it. But we'll be right back in just a minute and a half. And everyone refresh your drinks. All right. This is so great. As you may have guessed, we're used to slightly more intimate groupings. So it's really wonderful to have all of you here. And John.
Yes, all right, let's do it.
Oh, and I should also mention that the link that you have for tonight will work every Monday for the rest of the season. So if you're not on our mailing list, if you're not getting emails from us on Sunday nights, then just message me in the chat privately, and I'll make sure we get you on the mailing list. And we have a really exciting season coming up.
Yeah, next week, I think David Baker, right? Did you already say this?
Yeah.
And Paige Hill stars. Okay, cool.
And Paige is here. Paige is with us.
All right.
Oh,
no
so,
awesome.
Yeah.
Welcome, Paige. And yeah, I see some other familiar faces as well. It's really great to have everybody here.
I saw some celebrities. I saw Marie Howe was in here earlier. Donna Massini. I apologize if I'm missing anyone, but Faye Moskowitz. It's a star-packed night.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. And yeah, Jason and I try to replicate as much as we can the bar. You know, I have a red light bulb. He's got a background. That's about the best we can do. But we do encourage you to, as Jason said, throw some kind of tip towards KGB Bar, because they're a place that can't really stay. You know, New York City bars and restaurants can at least do sidewalk service now, but KGB doesn't even serve food. So they can't really do that, and you know, they're just kind of trying to figure out a way to keep it going. So anyway, that said, I'm really excited about our next poet. I think this year we all share the experience of having been quarantined, and I've been interested in how the experience of having your terrain limited, it can have the effect of making you look even more often at things like the sky or other things, you know, other than your phone obviously is another one, but things that are kind of constantly changing when, you know, you're limited in what you can actually see on a given day. And, you know, Jodi Bolz captures the essential present in her poetry in that kind of way, the spirit of, you know, wind in trees, taking a moment. Her poems capture the light, speed, stillness of motion and render patience, peace, and attentiveness, along with social conscience. And she's the author of A Lesson in Narrative Time, Shadow Play, and The Near and Far. She received her MFA from Cornell University, where she studied with A.R. Ammons. Her poems have appeared widely in literary magazines such as The American Scholar, North American Review, Plowshares, Poetry East, and Prairie Schooner, and in a number of anthologies, including Ghost Fishing, an Eco-Justice Poetry Anthology. She taught for more than 20 years at George Washington University and edited Poet Lore, America's oldest poetry journal, from 2002 to 2019. Here's Jodi.
Jodi, you're muted. Wait.
I'm here. I'm still
Okay.
here.
All right. I will remute. You're good.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. What Richard just said about time is hard. What is it? Time is hard to grasp. I think everything I've ever written has been about that. The fact that I have one book called A Lesson in Narrative Time and another called Shadow Play, which is a novella in verse all about trying to understand the past. And now this book, The Near and Far, supports the idea that I am baffled by time. I just want to say something about Richard for a second. Richard, are you there? The last time we were together was at Politics and Prose when we were giving real readings. I had just done my launch reading for this book, The Near and Far, and then Tony Hoagland, who's a mutual friend of Richard's and mine, Tony Hoagland's book, The Art of Voice, came out posthumously, as I know you did something with that too, at KGB. Anyway, so Richard and I met as young poets in the halls of GW, where we had an imaginary salon called the Tuesday Thursday Club. We imagined it clearly to be a literary sort of powerhouse of a salon, but in fact we never met, except I had two toddlers at home, I would pass Richard's office on my way home, and we would joke about it and how someday we would have a salon. So then we meet up again. I mean, we've seen each other a lot over the years, but then we met up to do this book reading from Tony's book, just right on the cusp of the pandemic. And here we are, the age we are, and they gave us these really high stools and handheld mics, and we both wear glasses, and we could barely sit on the stools. And then we had Tony's book and we had our notes. I mean, it was really a comedy show, but it's nice to be at home and to be comfortable here. I'm going to read a few poems from The Near and Far, which is no longer a new book, but if you take away the pandemic, it's pretty new. And it's a book about not just the nature of home, but the nature of retrospect. It's, I began these poems, I was writing a lot of very depressing poems about the early part of the 21st century. Think of all that happened, and we thought it couldn't get worse, right? But I suddenly realized we'd been in our home for 30 years. And I wrote a poem about looking back at the house from our backyard and thinking about that sweep of 30 years. Never imagining there would be a time when everybody, including our favorite newscasters, would be broadcasting from their own homes. And then I became obsessed. We have a bungalow, but I had to go into every corner and every room. So I'm going to start at the beginning with a poem called Threshold, though it's not the first poem in the book or the first poem in the title sequence. It is the way you enter the house. Threshold. When the house was first ours, before it smelled of paint and wax, before we'd laid down rugs or cooked a single meal in its small, outmoded kitchen, it had the stony scent of shade under a garden shed, the damp, unsettled smell of quiet and disuse, though it hadn't stood empty. We'd opened the back door and there it was, intractable as loneliness or the memory of loneliness, as if someone else's loss were lodged within our gain. And it seemed important. It seems important now that before we moved in, the house smelled stony and shadowed, even in the light of a mild November, as we crossed that threshold 10, 12, 20 times with tools and tiles and cleaning supplies. Each bright room blank, the walls and windows bare, steps uncarpeted, floorboards scarred. But how sure I felt, how safe, as if the history of this place had always been leading to the home we'd make. The home we were making that weirdly balmy fall, when a life seemed long. We go upstairs, passage. The upstairs hall is narrow, 5 strides long and 1 across. 3 rooms so close together that the children could call us from their beds if they were sick or scared. They didn't have to shout. The 4 of us were clustered in the roof line of the house, so we thought the kids felt safe. At least they never had to brave a long, dark corridor to find us. And for years we lived that way, within reach of one another, each bedroom ceiling streaked with a stanza of deflected light. Easy then to feel at home, the place adrift in puppets and picture books, toy animals in cheerful clothes, ragtag collections of marbles, fir cones, feathers, the local world's offerings of signs and wonders, antique bottles unearthed in the ravine, white stones round as story moons, objects of enchantment. And weren't we enchanted, though weary and worried, thwarted, sometimes grieving, both our fathers dying in those years we thought would last, but couldn't last, of course not. Our home, a home like that, only for children to grow up in and then leave, crossing the narrow hall away from us. I'm sure Richard is muted, so he can't answer this question, but this next poem moves out onto the front porch. We have a big front porch, and I believe you went out there to smoke during Jane Shore's book party. Is that correct? Okay, I know it did. Stormwatch. Were we on the porch already? The baby in her playpen, boy careening from the hammock to the rocking chair and back? Or did we rush out when the storm began, wanting to be almost in it, outside but still sheltered? Thunder thudding through our ribs, the kids spellbound and abstracted, never crying to be held. The downpour only yards away, cold spray of spring rain in our hair and on our faces. There was nothing for those minutes but the green world shudder and the sky split silver over our magnolia tree which swooned and beckoned, water pooling at its roots, then rushing to the street, the neighbors' houses indistinct, though maybe they were home too, standing at the windows, looking out at the four of us, a family in a shadow box that gleamed and dimmed and gleamed again before it went dark. This next poem, Evening, has ended up in a lot of places. It was published and then anthologized and then online. And mostly women responded to it, but I think these days, maybe having been at home for 6 months, there are more caretakers. Evening. Most days I cooked without gratitude, standing at the kitchen counter, rinsing and chopping and glancing at the clock at 5:50, 6:15, the violets on our windowsill backlit by sunset or outlined in winter dark. As I placed the pots to simmer over wide blue flames, stirring, tasting, seasoning our food, there was never any question of whether or when or what we might eat. We had everything we needed, and the fact seemed commonplace, our comfort commonplace. Each evening a steep course to master, task by task, scouring the cutting board, sponging the stovetop, talking to the children as they leaned over their worksheets, or looked up from time to time to spar with one another, or leapt to the door to let the cats back in. While I watched the hour pass behind a wall of windows, seasons in free fall like the pages of a flip book, green and gold and gone. And sometimes it snowed and the kids would drop their pencils, racing outside to see, but I didn't join them. I was barreling downhill in the midst of all that beauty, veering through each gate to be done and done and done. Another weekday evening vanishing beneath me, and now the level ground flung wide. Okay, my international research is not complete, but I am 99% sure this is the only love poem in any language to be written with the words solder and spackle. So I can't hear you laughing, but I hope you are laughing. Repairs. Who's kept track of the broken things you've fixed over the years? Repairs you've made as if they were nothing, never doubting you could figure out what tools to use, what steps to take. Why leave a task to someone else when you can do it, or at least you'll try, poring over diagrams, squinting at instructions, driving to the hardware store twice on a Saturday to gather supplies. Brackets for the rattling pipes, copper wire, solder, spackle, hinges, slide lock, thermostat, and items I can't even name. No system in this house seems alien to you. No failure alarming. So why am I surprised that I've learned next to nothing, understood next to nothing about heat and light and water, relying on you to know what's wrong and find a way to fix it? Relying on you never to break. Okay, I just have a few more. The book is called The Near and Far, and the title poem, in fact, is very long, which I understand some people over there at KGB would be sympathetic to. I think Matthew Yeager is a long poem writer, but too long for tonight. But this is a poem from the far part, though the far here is almost entirely metaphorical. Echo. All the years we spent expecting years to come. No thought of last things. Each spring, another spring, new grass at our feet. It was April. It was May. We sat out back at sunset, spread a map across our knees to plot a summer route. But I was never good at that. I struggled to make sense of distances and altitudes, the skewed concentric circles where mountains must be. I had to squint to picture the valleys and our figures stepping stone by stone across each ink blue line. The map itself a paper world, complete with its own key, while the real world's mysteries kept unfolding. How tender and deliberate and hopeful we were then. How tireless and baffled. Climbing months like switchbacks, you and I with the children behind us, and then beside us, and now so far ahead, shouting at a rock face to hear their ghosts shout back. The voice is theirs, or almost theirs, and then unrecognizable, except as falling human sounds. Now that I've read the poem Repairs, you might imagine correctly that someone in this house knows a lot about the furnace and energy conservation. But even that person can be overruled. So this poem is called Tableau. For beauty, not for heat, we built fires all winter. The small square of our hearth an altar or a theater. But what were we witnessing, beguiled by the smell and sound, the walls of the living room billowing around our gold and shadowed figures? Image of a family from another age. The firelight itself unfixed in time, unfixed in place, general as the dark and cold, as hunger and danger. Though we were warm and safe, furnace humming, radiators hot to the touch, our kitchen stocked mere steps from where we sat, reading or talking or listening to music. We barely sat in silence, and sometimes the phone rang or the cats cried to go out. But imagining it now, the only sound is the bright pulse of the fire, not the pop and hiss of burning, just the airy, errant thrumming of the flames. Okay, two more. This next one, the house itself, is kind of the bookend of Threshold. The house itself. Easy to believe this house belonged to strangers before it was ours, but impossible to picture strangers living here again. Waking in this room and stepping to the window to gaze out at the green. A view less open years from now. The red buds and native oaks we planted as saplings, grown tall by then, grown wide. How quickly it happens. You find a home to settle in, meet neighbors and restore the porch, pull wild vines from every bush, cut ivy from the trees. You jack and shim the sagging floor and back of the living room, repaint the walls, repair the garage. You buy an old farm table, rugs, hampers, chairs, and soon the place is yours. Its stairs and shadows, the doorway of each room, your clothes in the closets, your books on the shelves, your fire and your darkness, your infant in your arms. Even though you're only the size of postage stamps, you have been a great audience. This is the last poem I'll read. It's so nice to see you, Richard. I'm so glad we're not sitting on stools. February morning. I was standing in the bedroom looking out at our neighborhood. Winter sky striped pink and blue. The lawn, the streets, the houses just beginning to glow. An ordinary morning, like 10,000 other mornings I'd viewed from that window. Still, its beauty startled me, and I felt sad to think how little beauty matters when suffering is commonplace and vanishing unstoppable. It was as if I could see our life from far above, or maybe from the future. The hour already gone, the day gone, the room gone, and the scene itself a bright scrap, flaring in your hand. Thank you very much.
It's just that you're actually allowed to unmute yourself. I set this.
Unmute.
Yeah, so you can actually unmute yourself to clap. I just can't unmute you all at once. But you're actually welcome to unmute yourself. I probably should not have set the setting that way. I didn't mean to. You weren't supposed to be allowed to unmute yourself, but you can.
Yay, Jodi. Yay, Richard.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you.
Jodi, Richard, thank you. That was so wonderful. And so I want to reiterate that this link will work for every Monday for the rest of the season.
However you found it, save it, because it's not necessarily, I don't know if you guys know, have the same experience as me on the internet, but sometimes you think you have something, you know, and you lose it. That's so.
Yeah.
And next Monday, we're going to have Paige Hill Starzinger. Paige, am I saying your name right?
Yes.
I want to make sure that I'm getting that correct. With David Baker, which will be really, really exciting. And then the week after that, we have Lynn Sachs and Paolo Javier. And the week after that, we have Jonathan Lee and Anne-Marie Fife and Tom Slay. And if you want more listings, you'll have to join the mailing list. So just
or
send
follow
me your
the Instagram. It's
yeah, that's right. Or follow us. Absolutely, yeah. What is the Instagram handle, Jada? Are you
KGB Monday Night?
KGB Monday Night?
Yeah.
And don't ask us about other nights at KGB. We only do Monday night. If you were booked for Sunday and you made a mistake, we can't help you. We're only Monday nights.
If people want to type their emails in the chat, I'll go through and copy and paste them. I think I have the master email list over here inside my computer.
Well, speaking of which, yeah, it is true. Matthew Yeager is a fan of the long poem.
Yeah,
That's something
Yeah.
that is something we can confirm. Yeah.
That's all I can manage to write anymore.
That happened. I find that the longer I write, the longer my poems get. Like when I was an undergraduate, my poems were like this big, and I would try to write a long poem, and then it would just end up being like 4 sections. I'd be like, damn it! I thought I had a long poem, but I just had sections.
All you need to do is age a bit.
Yes. Aging is very good for one's writing.
Can I just say one thing before we go?
Sure.
I even feel embarrassed to say this, but since my book came out barely pre-pandemic, if anybody wants to see it and wants to avoid Amazon, try Politics in Prose.
Okay.
That's where I gave my launch reading, and they still have some copies, and I can get them more copies if they need them.
I went through a bookshop, and they didn't have the cover image, and so I went back to Amazon. That's why I put the link for Amazon in the chat.
That's great. Amazon's fine, I guess.
Yeah. So if you look in the chat, everyone has links.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I will also give the link one more time to the KGB Venmo. So if anybody wants to support Seiji, our beloved bartender, while he is furloughed, here you go. This is
No,
the...
I'm just trying to do what I'm doing.
Nice.
Oh, thank you, Hetty.
I know the best part of Venmo, the best part of Zoom is always the people who weren't expected.
No, I know what
Oh,
I'm
it's
doing.
beautiful.
I want to go down.
It's beautiful. What press is it on?
It's Turning Point.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fantastic.
Is it on bookshop.org also?
I'm not sure. You know, I was going to do that. I was supposed to go on a book tour that, of course, didn't happen. And I was going to have it there, but I was going to be selling in the individual places. I don't know. I have to check. Thanks for asking.
It's a great alternative to Amazon.
I'm sorry?
It's a great alternative to Amazon.
Okay,
Yeah.
But you just sent the link to Politics and Prose, right, Jodi?
I will.
I
Which
think
is
you
great.
did. Somebody did.
No, oh yeah, someone did.
So it did?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
Excellent.
I'm not
So,
following.
yeah, so follow
Jesse's
that.
done it.
And I'm trying to make sure that I'm getting all the, thank you everyone who's sending me your email address right now. And I'm trying to make sure that I get all these before we go.
I'm doing the
Hi.
same thing, Jason.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Well, I'm going to chime in for a minute too. Jodi and Richard, boy, I love you, and it is marvelous to see your faces. I live on a farm, and I got to go do farm chores, but boy, it's been a long time, and this was such a pleasure. So it's great to see you all. Richard, love to you as well. Okay.
Yes. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, so fun.
Thank everybody who's here for managing to ward off Zoom exhaustion, which we all have.
Thank
Really-
you, Jogo.
Yeah,
Love
especially
you.
at the top
It
of the
was
school year.
lovely. It was just lovely.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me, Jodi.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye.